Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 7, which is about the skeletal system. A great chapter to study in the month of October. There's lots of partially anatomically correct decorations around. So I've left a couple of these little skeleton guys for you guys. Feel free to take a look at them. They can be very useful. Just keep in mind that they're not entirely anatomically correct because I got them from Target. So today we're going to dive into the axial skeleton, which is of course going to be the bones, including the skull, the sternum, the vertebrae, and then all of those connecting parts to the appendicular skeleton, which is of course your appendages, your arms and your legs. So we're going to introduce some of these bone markings, and hopefully this will give you some good a heads up on completing that exercise 5. Keep in mind that for this next lab quiz, it's kind of a doozy. It's 100 points. You'll have to know all the 206 bones of the adult skeleton and also some of its surface markings. So some bones like the femur have a dozen surface markings on them because these are connections to muscles primarily. Also, there are articulation points with other bones, but some you don't need to know quite as many. But of these 206 named bones, about 80 of them will be part of the axial skeleton, which is what we're going to introduce today. Then other ones in the appendicular skeleton are a little bit simpler. They're probably bones you're more familiar with. And although there are 126, nearly all of them are paired. You'll have a left and a right. So it's really not as many bones as it may seem. So the first terms that you have to get figured out in your brain is axial versus appendicular. So not only are these bones in different parts of the body, with the axial being on that center axis, so the skull, the jaw, the vertebrae, the ribs and sternum, they also have a different function. The axial skeleton's primary function is the protection of internal organs, whereas the appendicular skeleton, which includes the arms and legs and the attachment points, so like the pectoral girdle, which would be the shoulders and clavicle, and the hips, those are going to be primarily for movement. So big differences in the shapes of these bones and of course their functions because those things go hand in hand. So in your book you can see very clearly the axial versus appendicular. The only thing that students occasionally will get mixed up is that all of the attachment points, including the clavicle, the shoulder blade, the hips, belong to the appendicular skeleton. So the only thing in your axial skeleton is going to be the skull, vertebrae, sternum, and ribs. Think of the axial skeleton as the bones that you could not live without because their job is to protect those internal organs, which would of course be the brain and the skull. The thoracic cavity protects the lungs and the heart. You could live a pretty normal functional life without one of your appendicular bones, but if you're missing any of these axial bones, it can really be a hindrance to proper functioning. So the next group of terms are classifying your bones according to their shape or more rarely their location. So most of the bones that you probably think about when you think about bones are like this tibia. They are long bones, meaning they have a greater length than a width. So most of your bones that you probably already know are long bones. Keep in mind though, not every long bone is long. Here we have a foot. This has been articulated or kind of tied together. And even the phalanges, these teeny tiny bones, like in the last bone on your little toe, is technically still a long bone because it is still longer than it is wide. It's very tiny, but it is still technically a long bone. The short bones, by comparison, are like our tarsals and carpals. So they're these cube-looking bones that make up your ankles and your wrists. So they are about as long as they are wide. So carpals, you drive your car with your carpals, so those are the wrist bones. And you walk on the tar with your tarsals, which are going to be the foot and ankle bones. Then we have some flat bones. Flat bones are like, this is like your sternum. So sternum is your breastplate, and the ribs. So the ribs also are very flat. So they're still long, but they're considered flat bones because of their internal structure. Most of our long bones, you'll see in a few minutes, have distinct heads on the ends of them and articular surfaces. They also have an internal structure, including an internal cavity where there's bone marrow, yellow bone marrow specifically. Flat bones don't have these structures. They're basically sheets of compact bone with red marrow inside. So the difference in structure is not just in their overall shape, because this is still pretty long as a rib, but because of that internal structure as well. Irregular bones, like your vertebrae, don't have a typical shape. They have a very specialized shape because they have a very specialized function. We also consider the bones of our skull, or our cranium rather, the part that protects your brain, to be flat, whereas the facial bones are irregular. So the face of the skull is actually a whole bunch of bones that we'll talk about in a little bit, and they have specific shapes, again, because of their function. Two other very odd bones. The sesamoid bone is just your two patellas or your kneecaps. They're shaped like a sesame seed. If I can find one in the box here. There it is. So there's that that patella, sesamoid bone, and then the sutral bones you can see in this diagram here are the ones that are located in the skull, and they are just found between those joining points of the cranium. So those are found only in infants. Okay, so the other big idea today is to start learning some of these surface markings. So besides the 206 bones, you'll also be responsible for knowing some of the structural features, because these will be really important as we learn the muscles in Unit 4. So they really come into two groups. The first group are depressions or openings. So they're parts of the bone that are pushed in. And then the other ones are processes. These are parts of the bones that stick out. So for example, when we're looking at a vertebrae, this is a typical lumbar vertebrae from the lower back, so it's big and bulky. You can see that the processes stick out, and then there are some parts where we have holes or openings where it passes through or it's pushed in. So typically the depressions and openings will attach to a process to form a joint. Okay. Also, all these processes stick out to be attachment points for ligaments and tendons, whereas the openings are passageways. In this case, this is the vertebral foramen. This is where your spinal cord goes. Okay. We can also see all kinds of depressions and openings on the skull, where we have passageways for lots of different blood vessels and nerves and whatnot. So we have some specific names for these. As far as the depressions and openings go, a fissure is a narrow slit, a foramen is a hole, and a fossa is a shallow depression. So all three of these just happen to be really well shown on our skull. So I'm going to take my mandible off here. The fissure that they're showing is at the back of the orbit or the eye socket. That supraorbital fissure that is in the sphenoid bone is actually the passageway for the optic nerve. A foramen is a hole. This is called the foramen magnum, literally the big hole. And this is, again, where the brainstem and the spinal cord exit from the cranium. And then the fossa, also on the bottom, it might be hard to see, but this is actually the mandibular fossa, which is where the mandible will articulate, or it just kind of sits in there. You can see there's this little condyle that sticks into that mandibular fossa. Okay. A sulcus is a groove or passageway, and a meatus is a tube-like opening. So here we can see on the humerus, we have an intertubercular sulcus. So it's in between two tubercles. And you can see here we have a greater tubercle and a lesser tubercle. In between is a passageway for one of the larger arteries of the upper arm. Okay, and then the meatus here is the external auditory meatus, which is just your ear canal. So that's a lot of your indentations or your holes, and now we'll talk about the parts that stick out. Remember, a lot of times these surface markings that stick out are attachment points for muscles, or they serve as attachment points for articulations with other bones. So here we have at the distal end, so here's a lot of these anatomical terms from Unit 1 will come back to haunt you. At the distal end or the bottom of your femur, we have these two rounded projections that we call condyles. We have one on the medial surface and one on the lateral surface. So we have the medial and lateral condyle. They're very smooth and they will actually articulate with the um, tibia that we talked about earlier. Let's see here. There it goes. Okay, so we can see that that forms that knee joint, so it's nice and smooth. Just superior to our condyles are the epicondyles. These are the rough and bumpy surfaces on the medial side and the lateral side where we have attachment points for muscles and tendons and ligaments. So the condyles are the smooth parts. Epicondyles are above the condyles and they are rough and bumpy. I will leave the big black boxes of bones. So you guys feel free to get your hands on some of these structures so you can actually look at them. A facet is a smooth, flat, concave surface. So again, the facets, we have superior and inferior articular facets on our vertebrae. A head, I don't know why they show the rib because the head on the femur is much more obvious. Just this round projected surface that is supported on a neck. A crest is a prominent ridge. Here we're looking at the sacrum, which I do not have in my box, but you can find it in that big black box when you're working. And then a line is a less prominent ridge. It's less prominent than a crest. Here you have the superior and inferior nuchal lines that are on the back portion of the skull on that occipital bone. A spinous process. These are the inferior projections on your vertebrae. And then the trochanter is only on the femur. It's this big guy right up here. It's the attachment point for a lot of those hip flexor muscles. Here we have tubercles. Tubercles are rounded projections and tuberosities are rough and bumpy projections. So a lot of these, I'm not going to test you on, what's the difference between a tubercle and a tuberosity. It's more just so you have some context when you start learning the actual surface markings. Okay, so that wraps up our notes for today. Hopefully this has given you some background information so you can continue to work on exercise 5. Remember, you have a Quizlet set. Even your practice lab quiz could potentially help you with some of these surface markings if you're struggling. And don't forget that tomorrow, Chapter 7 homework is due. You can either hand that to the sub or you can upload that directly to Schoology or to Buzz. Feel free to reach out to me via Remind or send me an email if you have any questions that the sub can't answer for you. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you later.